Hello and welcome to today's ISNTD Connect meeting. It's lovely to see everyone back again for today's session, and for those who are new to the series, just a very quick reminder, I'm Marianne Comperet and I'm speaking from the International Society for Neglected Tropical Diseases. The ISNTD Connect meetings were launched at the beginning of lockdown to help researchers and professionals in the fields of tropical and infectious diseases remain connected. So already we're creeping up to our 30th meeting soon, and over the weeks we've heard from a really wide range of colleagues from around the world on a very varied array of topics, and we've had some fantastic discussions. So today we're going to be speaking about the incredible potential of drug repurposing to fill some of the many remaining gaps in the treatment of neglected, or in fact any, hard to treat infectious diseases. We're talking about a category that contains both numerous and really varied diseases, but which share this common trait of being seriously underfunded and under-researched, and which means that any strategy to improve the efficiency of NTD drug discovery and to deliver these within with limited resources will be really important, must be looked at very seriously and thoroughly supported. And this is really very topical. So just this week, with all eyes on COVID-19, we've all heard the fantastic news that dexamethasone, which is essentially a cheap and widely available steroid treatment to help in lots of other conditions, that can help the lives of patients seriously ill with coronavirus. And again, earlier on, there have been many discussions about the potential for our beloved ivermectin to have significant impact on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and with results coming in from that recent US clinical trial. Reductions in malaria morbidity have been reported following azithromycin mass drug administration for trachoma, and the list goes on. So this is really a very exciting and promising field. Unfortunately, a large part of the body of investigation and evidence remains at times quite scattered. So in 2013, a very exciting collaboration between the US FDA and the National Institutes of Health, subsequently supported by partners including the World Health Organization and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, launched the CureID mobile app and website. And the CureID app and website was designed to capture reports directly from healthcare providers on how they are repurposing drugs, and this central repository being really unique as a bridge between anecdotal case reports and randomized clinical trials with data coming in from around the world. So this is a really exciting time to look at drug repurposing, and on top of it, with all these innovative new tools coming in, we thought it would be a great opportunity to have a review of where we're at in terms of this issue, and also perhaps introduce you and also encourage everybody to get involved with the CureID app and website and support this initiative. So we're thoroughly delighted today to welcome a fantastic panel of 3 speakers who will take us through many of these issues. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome Dr. Nathalie Strub-Wourgaft, who's Director of Neglected Tropical Diseases at DNDi. Nathalie, hello.
Hello.
Hi, nice to see you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we will also then hear from Heather Stone. Heather is Health Science Policy Analyst at the US Food and Drug Administration, and more specifically at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And Heather, you'll be talking to us in a bit more detail about the CureID app, the website, and how all that works. And so hello, Heather. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
And also, I'd like very happy to welcome Dr. Tiziana Masini. Tiziana, you are an expert in public health with specific focus on pharmaceutical research and development. And recently, you've been working with the World Health Organization's NTD department to assess the potential of the CureID tool for NTD treatments. So Tiziana, to you as well, a very, very warm welcome. Oh, sorry, Tiziana, this is the classic rite of passage. I have to say your microphone was muted.
Thank you.
Now, great. So very warm welcome to you three. So without any further ado, I'll be handing over to Nathalie, who will tell us a little bit more about the gaps and also the opportunities in drug repurposing for NTDs. So Nathalie, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to share. Okay, so I will open my screen. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much to Heather and the WHO and ISNTD for inviting us to share a little bit of our experience in the value of drug repurposing for NTDs, and now we have to say also for COVID-19. So maybe, okay, I think Heather already mentioned this, but to just frame the discussion, we're talking repurposing. Sometimes we hear also the word repositioning. So the difference between the two is at which stage do you inherit of the new treatment, the new drug. So repurposing usually means that something that has already been registered. Repositioning is more something that was developed initially for one indication, didn't continue, and is considered for a new indication. I think here, for the philosophy, where for QID it's more repurposing, but for us as a research organization, it could be repositioning. I'll give different examples. So maybe starting first with NTDs. I think the community online knows quite well the topic of NTDs, the characteristics of the fact that it's first affecting over 1 billion people, half of them being children. It affects the poor patients. It entertains, or it's typical of what is called a vicious cycle of poverty. People being poor are more susceptible to being affected by tropical diseases. They don't have access to proper treatment. They might therefore increase suffer from more morbidity, sometimes mortality, which will affect the overall economic of their own family or the country. And therefore that entertains this vicious cycle of poverty. More importantly now, there's been a welcomed change in the common objectives set by the United Nations with the SDG 3 that is targeting elimination of all the neglected tropical diseases. And also, as I think Dr. Malecela already spoke about, this very important roadmap that explains what is expected and when are efforts and deliverables expected to happen to reach these ambitious 2030 goals for NTD. So we still have a lot to do. And any effort, as Heather was mentioning just before, will be critical. In fact, when you speak about NTDs, you speak about this fatal imbalance. So we published twice in 2002, then 2011, reports looking at what is the landscape of efforts for neglected tropical diseases versus the burden. And that highlighted this real imbalance. But interestingly, when we did the second review in 2011, looking at what had been developed between 2000 and 2010, which was the time where some PDPs started and some initiatives. What you can see here, number 3, is that most of the new efforts were resulting from repurposing. I'll go in details in this. So this is a typical pipeline or value chain, if you wish. So you start from early discovery, you optimize, you identify targets, you optimize, you produce, you manufacture a pill, a treatment, you then test it in animal models. Then it goes to man, phase 1, translation, and then full clinical development, and then implementation. So the entire process takes around 10 years. So we immediately, when DNDi was founded in 2003, we developed this pragmatic approach of having, a long-term, long-term, and I'm sorry, there's a typo here because short-term should be on the right. strategy where you initially start by geographic extension or improvement of regulatory dossier development of them for access in some specific regions, but that's where the medium term is the new indications. We'll look at this now. So just the background of what was needed is when we started, the treatments were either ineffective or prone to resistance or toxic or expensive or very difficult to use or not registered in some regions or protected by patents. So the need still stands. We need safe, effective, field-adapted, affordable, and available treatments for NTDs. So this is a slide that I'd like to take a little time on. Why? Because what we are seeing here, this is the standard value chain, the process of clinical development. So when you start at the very start of a full new chemical entity, the full range of discovery, you will start by having successive steps, which I described a little bit earlier, but which each have an attrition attached to it. So you might lose, you might fail, and you will fail and have to restart. Obviously, when you start at the late stage, you will have access, you will save time to patients by de-risking the safety, because when you start with a drug that is repurposed, there's a lot of information that you already know about the safety of that drug at the indication that was developed. But there's a lot of information, not only from the clinical trial, but also from the post-approval, post-marketing surveillance. So you know a lot. You will increase your chances of success because you've gone to the end of the process, at least with a drug. So you know it can be well formulated, you know it's not toxic, you know it has some level of efficacy, you know the PK, you know how it distributes, and you have learned a lot about the drug. And if you think of physicians, when you come to them with a drug that's already been developed and tested, or sometimes that they have tested, and that really, for example, typically affects, we can speak about hydroxychloroquine, loperamide, ritonavir, and COVID, they know the drug. So already they know a little bit about the safety, even for another indication. So obviously by starting, if you start at the on the right side of the slide, you will also save costs and facilitate access, because some of the, for example, if the dossier has been registered, you don't need to go through a full approval. You will just have an additional approval, which is faster. So that is really the, I think the showing the, not only the easiness, but the speed of access, which sometimes is very critical. And this is very important to have in mind. So this slide shows the DNDi portfolio as it stands from December 2019. So on the right side, drugs that have are in the implementation side. On the left side, the discovery, so always the same. And you can see those that are circled, lined up in green, are those which come from repurposed efforts. And that's, so obviously you can see some on the right-hand side, which is, if you wish, the short-term strategy, as I showed before. We still have some in the medium term. So it is not because we have a portfolio that does, discovery, that we don't always still look at repurposed options. And we'll go into this in a minute. So this is, I'll go through 4 diseases and then move to COVID. So sleeping sickness. So sleeping sickness, we've had the full range of activities, including NCE, well, starting by repurposing, moving to discovery of an NCE. So we, I think already sleeping sickness, but it's in essence, in 1950s, melarsoprol was a very good but toxic drug that was developed for and used for arsenic-based for sleeping sickness. In the mid-70s, nifurtimox was developed and approved for Chagas disease. In 1981, if fluornithine was identified as a treatment that could have some efficacy in cancer, it didn't work. But then they showed that they could be developed to reduce hair growth. So it was developed as a topical for hirsutism. But and then also at some point there was some work done in animal and in vitro studies showed it could be used in HAT. So this drug that was initially for cancer and hirsutism was registered in 1990s for sleeping sickness, but because it required 56 injections, and that was really tough for healthcare workers, there were different studies looking at other regimens to combine it with nifurtimox, shorten the treatment, and by combining get to something that would be more easily scalable. Which happened, and then next this combination was added to the WHO essential list and became the treatment of reference. Then with Sanofi, at the same time we were doing this, we were doing some more upstream research, identified fexinidazole from nitroimidazole data mining, and went through the full development of fexinidazole, which resulted in an approval in DRC in 2018. But in addition to that, we included development, and we have a new NC that is still in development with a unique dose. So you see here, the approach is really started by benefiting very much from repurposing. The example of leishmaniasis is also quite illustrative. So for leishmaniasis, which is we're talking either visceral leishmaniasis or cutaneous leishmaniasis associated with higher mortality. So for this disease, some academic researchers in the end 80s were looking at miltefosine, shown that it could have an effect in infected macrophages, and identify them as possible candidates. In parallel, miltefosine was initially developed to treat some cancer diseases, but was not shown to be effective. The work conducted by the academics shown that it had, in fact, effect in animal models, which were also developing at that time with in animals with Donovani and Infantum. And so it started to be tested in clinical trials in the early 2000 and up to 2011, and got finally approved, even approved in the US with a priority review voucher. So a very interesting, progress roadmap for this drug that is now used in VL, tested in VL clinical trials in East Africa, for patients with VL, in patients who are co-infected with HIV and have VL, either in Ethiopia or in India, and used in combination with parmomycin in India as one of the recommended treatments. It is also used in PKDL, which is a complication of leishmaniasis, and tried in clinical trials in Sudan and in Bangladesh. And in addition to that, we are testing it in combination with thermotherapy in Latin America, and MSF may do a study as well in the old world. So you can see that this compound, which came from really another world, has suddenly become one of the pillars of the leishmaniasis treatments. This is another one that's interesting. So for onchocerciasis, we have a number of repurposed candidate drugs that are listed here. And what's interesting, it comes from the animal model, animal health. So these compounds have been identified for their efficacy in the infections by helminths in animals, and reformulated to be tested in man. And I have to say that we're now testing emodepside. We finished the phase 1 program, which we had to do, but there was all the work on toxicity. You see, all the preclinical work was done. The manufacturing was done, but we still had to redo a formulation because it was a formulation adapted to animals. But we will be ready to start a proof of concept study, phase 2, in early next year. So we have saved time on this one, and that's a more recent example. The last example for the NTDs is mycetoma, another interesting story with phosphavuconazole, who initially was developed for onychomycosis by Eisai, who then we tested for potential efficacy in Chagas disease, so a parasitological NTD. It didn't show efficacy, well, not at the regimen that we wanted to use. And so at the same time, we identified that it could have some efficacy. And in fact, it had the most potent efficacy ever seen in vitro models for Madurella mycetomatis, the agent of this horrible fungal disease. And so now we are testing it in the first ever randomized controlled trial in Sudan for another fungal disease. It's a very interesting, you see the chain. So it's between repurposing and repositioning, but it's a repurposing because this compound was approved in Japan for onychomycosis in 2017. So, so you see all the value of the repurposed efforts. Now, for COVID, we're in another situation. So, I think in February of 2020, the WHO convened a very important meeting to try and identify the gaps and what should be done. They identified different work streams, and one for therapeutics. So therapeutics, you're looking at prevention of healthcare workers' infection, you're looking at severe patients, you're looking at mild, moderate patients. And they do highlight the need for access to repurposed drugs. And this scheme that I downloaded today, because it's a kind of live document from the Lancet, illustrates the types of compounds that are being tested for COVID infection. And I circled the ones that come from repurposed drugs. I wasn't sure about the immune one on the right side. So, but at least if you look at those on the left-hand side, all of them that I can identify are repurposed ones. And you can see how everything now is relying on existing drug. And why is that? It's also because there wasn't much that we knew about this specific virus. There's a lot of questions. So I think, with bridging from in vitro data showing antiviral efficacy on other drugs, bridging from information gathered through clinical trials, and here I think clearly the QRID type of initiative, when you look at the volume of data they can bring at some point, may help to identify one compound that we should then assess through a thorough process to decide whether or not it should be another candidate to conduct clinical trials. It is essential because we have such an urgency of finding something. And in fact, DNDi has convened a meeting. There is a whole initiative with a therapeutic accelerator, so an initiative that we are attached to. So we developed a TPP for this, and I just would like to share how the thinking around when you get repurposed candidates, then you have to do some kind of homework and assessment of how do you select the best candidate. So we had a meeting where we've discussed, what are the level of evidence, what is the level of evidence that we have from in vitro data, from lung penetration, from clinical information that can then help us to select the drugs out of those which are already on the market or registered, if you wish, just because otherwise, and this is something I may have not insisted enough on, it's thinking about the access and thinking about the barriers. If you have not, the drug is not registered, you will have to take a lot of time to get it registered, and you have to make sure that the scalability of the drug is possible, that you have manufacturers, and we will have sustainable access to the drug. So with repurposed drugs, that is more easy to understand and to anticipate that obviously with a drug that's not yet been largely produced. So I think I'm almost finished. So here we made a review that was published in October, November of this last year, where we looked from our past 15 years experience. I mentioned there's a cost impact, and it's quite clear that when you look at the cost to develop a NECT, which brought significant improvement in the lives of HAT patients versus when you have more different investment for different benefit as well, well, obviously the costs are going to be slightly different. So to conclude, I think we still need these. We still need the job is really, you know, as said before, the job is not done for NTDs. There's a lot that we need to do. When we have access to candidates, you know, that are already there, we know we're going to save time on de-risking all the things that can go wrong, and many will go wrong during a standard R&D process. So by having something you know more about, of course, it's much easier, and you know that you will also have higher chances of having less attrition. That's very important if you think about your time pressure. Of course, because you're adapting, you always have to understand what will be your regulatory pathways. But again, here, it's always easier. I think we've shown the value for repurposed drugs for some NTDs, and there's more NTDs. And we're now showing the value. It's so clear for COVID. So we have to continue this. And I hope that you will have been convinced and, you know, feel also that anything you can bring as physicians, any information is useful. We need to learn more about the drugs. So I think I'll end for now, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
And Nathalie, thank you so much for this amazing overview. It's given us much food for thought, and certainly, as you very clearly demonstrated, that being under this COVID situation, this emergency, has really shifted the way we perhaps need to tackle treatments in future, and you know, going straight to existing molecules, perhaps starting from there. And there's been one very interesting comment on our chat from our colleague and friend Stephen Bramer, who is saying, if you know each other, that's great. And Stephen was saying, now that repurposing and repositioning has been demonstrated as beneficial. Oops, sorry, the question disappeared. Yes, now that repurposing, repositioning has been demonstrated as beneficial, is it prudent to suggest that future drug development must start with a multitude of objectives, i.e. the idea of a single formula for one disease is archaic? We must start viewing our chemical formula as multi-purpose instead of single purpose. What are your thoughts on this, Nathalie?
That's a really nice question. It's putting the bar really high. Right. It's putting the bar high because, you know, sometimes it's so complicated. It depends on the diseases, depends on everything. So I can say that when we test a compound for kinetoplastid, we test a compound for kinetoplastid, meaning if we always look in other indications within our remit of NTDs, because that's obviously it's one way of saving time. Definitely, yes. I would say that after that, when you get into man, it becomes complicated. We are doing this for leash and cutaneous leishmaniasis. Obviously, we try to benefit from what we learn in VL for CL or the reverse. Usually it's that way. To bridge from one or the other directly usually doesn't work exactly as we would like. We have a class of drugs like oxaborols that we're testing in sleeping sickness. We tested them in Chagas against T. cruzi. So the class could work, not exactly the same compound. So ideally, I would say yes. In reality, we haven't had exactly that success yet.
So if I could just jump in with one comment. I mean, I think DNDi has been really leading the way in terms of looking at the full potential of the compounds for all of the diseases within their remit, and for looking at it broadly. As Nathalie said, maybe it's not the exact compound, but it's the same class, or it's the same, it's cousins of each other or something. And so being able to learn from the experience across diseases. The one thing that I would say that I think we could do a better job of in general is that, with the exception of groups like DNDi, most of the time in drug development, the full breadth of the molecule's potential is explored in a much more limited sense, either for the diseases that are the focus of that particular drug company. So for example, many companies have left the antimicrobial space, so they'll screen their drugs for ALS or dementia or something, but they won't look at even if they found that a drug might be effective in a space that is not one that they do, they are often not keen to develop it. Sometimes they'll license it out to someone else to develop, but a lot of times they just don't want to be bothered. And then the second piece is that, relatedly, there has been an emphasis historically on only pursuing those indications which will be lucrative for the drug sponsor. So, there's a lot of looking for every cancer, every rare disease where they think that they can charge a lot. And those are the indications that are pursued for drug approvals, in particular in the US for marketing. And those that have potential for high public health benefit, but not necessarily any remuneration, may well not be pursued. And so I think if we can try to move towards a more public health centric and high unmet need focused drug development approach, where the driving factor is not the financial incentives that can be gained from pursuing a supplemental approval or indication for a drug, but rather the public health benefit that would be gained, we as a society would be much more successful in terms of having drugs for the treatments that affect the most number of people and with the sort of greatest impact.
Fully agree with you, Heather.
Dream on, I know, but that's the hope.
No, and to be, I mean, if I can just follow up, we've had access to these libraries, and it's true that it's a gold mine. It's a gold mine. There's many things there.
Right, and I think that's where we do have to give many of these companies credit, is that they have given groups like DNDi access, and that's really been a game changer, I think. But if we can see more of that on a broader scale, as well as more collaborations, right? There's a lot that these companies can bring to the table in terms of their experience, and again, I think DNDi has seen that. But to work with groups that have other motivations, and to collaborate to then move something forward.
Yeah.
And it's been actually very encouraging to see a lot of the stakeholders in this area coming up with very innovative ways to collaborate. So being open source, but maybe not completely open. So kind of protecting, as you said, those financial goals, as well as enabling any other stakeholders who want to take part to also carry on with this work. So a lot of change, and definitely a space to be watched and facilitated and accelerated by something like your app. Any tool that simplifies that process is, of course, very important and timely.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's really exciting to be here with you for this ISNTD Connect series. And I'll be discussing with you an introduction to the CureID platform, including its utility and applicability in the NTD, as well as the COVID space. Just a little housekeeping. I have no financial disclaimers to report. This presentation will contain significant discussion of the use of medical products for diseases and conditions that are not included in the FDA-approved drug labeling. The discussion should not be construed as promoting unapproved uses of approved drugs, or that the data should be used for anything more than hypothesis generation. It's also important to note the intent and limitations of the data. CureID is not intended to be used by pharmaceutical companies or manufacturers to advertise or promote unapproved uses of approved drugs. Individual case reports are insufficient to establish the safety or effectiveness of a new use of an approved product, and inclusion of data in the CureID repository does not indicate that FDA, NIH, or other CureID partners endorse its validity, reliability, or usefulness in making individual patient treatment decisions. So with that, here's a brief outline of what we'll be discussing. First will be a background of what exactly drug repurposing is, followed by a demonstration of the CureID platform, a discussion of the data that's collected and commonly asked questions, its potential applicability for COVID-19, and then a brief discussion of the launch of a public-private partnership, the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory. So what is drug repurposing? While there are many different definitions, the one we'll use today is that drug repurposing is the identification of potential novel uses of existing drugs. There is a significant lack of adequate approved treatments for many infectious diseases, which Nathalie will detail more in the future. However, the clinical experience on how existing drugs are being used can be collected, and that would enable promising candidates, drug combinations, and treatment regimens to be quickly identified and then inform clinical trials that could be conducted to investigate these potential new uses. So what kinds of new information can be gleaned from looking at existing drugs? Well, the most obvious is finding new ways of treating diseases, so new diseases or indications. We could also look at drug repurposing as looking at new combinations of drugs that might be helpful, new dosing regimens or durations of therapy, as well as new populations that might benefit from existing treatments. But importantly, unapproved uses that do not work or are harmful to patients must also be identified so that their use can be dissuaded. Based upon this background, we developed a platform to try to capture novel uses of existing drugs directly from healthcare providers around the world. The platform, CureID, is an internet-based repository that was developed as a collaboration between FDA and NIH, as well as with the support of IDSA, WHO, DNDi, and others. And it gives the global clinical community the opportunity to share novel uses of existing drugs for patients with difficult to treat infectious diseases through a website, a smartphone, or other mobile device. The goal of the platform is threefold. The first is to enhance the understanding of new uses of approved medical products. Second is to facilitate clinical trials and drug development. And third is to serve as a resource for physicians to share information where no FDA-approved product, which has been proven to be safe and effective, exists for a new use. I encourage you all to follow along as I go through a quick demonstration of the app and website. You can visit the website at cure.ncats.io or download the app from the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store as CureID, where it's freely available as both. There's a quick registration process that takes less than 30 seconds. You just need to enter an email and password and then your qualifications and certify that you're a licensed healthcare professional. While the app is applicable to a number of infectious diseases, it seems particularly well suited to a few broad categories. The first would be neglected infectious or tropical diseases. Second, antimicrobial resistant organisms. And third, emerging threats, which the current COVID pandemic is highlighting. In all of these groups, we're looking at those diseases specifically which have insufficient or no approved therapies. We've identified a couple of pilot priority diseases where we're specifically trying to generate activity in communities. And these include COVID-19, mycetoma, atypical or non-tuberculous mycobacteria, drug-resistant gonorrhea, rare and resistant fungal infections, particularly in transplant patients, as well as multi-drug resistant gram-negative organisms. The platform includes the 4 major features that follow. First is the Explore function, where users can view reported case reports, both from individual clinicians as well as the published literature. And they can view these cases individually in detail as they were entered, as well as in aggregate, in addition to discussion forum posts and clinical trials. The Create feature allows you to enter your own case report or discussion post using an easy electronic or mobile platform. One can comment by joining the conversation on case reports or discussion posts from other users. And a news feed allows the users to stay up to date on the latest infectious disease news, including journal articles, events, and submissions to CureID. I'll now run through some screenshots of the app itself so you can see the different features in action. So the first part is the Explore feature, which allows you to see the case reports, discussion posts, and clinical trials organized by disease. You can search by disease, and then if you click on a particular disease and case report number, then you can see those cases that were reported for that particular disease organized by the number of cases where a particular drug was used. So as an example, here we look at the case reports for COVID-19, which currently are approximately 160 cases. And I can see that there were 10 cases where tocilizumab was used. If I click on that, then I can see the information segregated by whether the drug was used as monotherapy or in a combination, and which combinations it was used in, and then sorted by outcome. So here I can see for tocilizumab that there was 1 case where the patient deteriorated. And if I want to see the full details of that report, then I can click on that information and see both a summary level view as well as viewing the entire case report. The Explore feature also includes the discussion posts where questions can be asked of the global clinical community and responses garnered from both experts as well as clinicians around the world. One can also explore clinical trials. This pulls information directly from clinicaltrials.gov, where it is curated by a physician and focuses on drug treatments for these particular diseases. The Create feature allows a user to submit either a case report or a discussion post. The case report form is a very simple, very focused case report that allows a user to enter all of the pertinent information about their patient in just a few moments. It's collected in an entirely de-identified fashion so that patient's privacy is protected. There are 8 questions which we include in what we call the quick submit, which are the required questions. And these outline the disease that the patient suffered from, the drugs that were used, why the drugs were being used in a new way, why they were being repurposed, how the diagnosis of the disease was made, whether it was laboratory confirmed or not. Then the outcome of treatment, whether any adverse events occurred, and whether the clinician would like a reminder to update the case at a later date. Then the clinician has the option to either submit the case with that limited but useful information, or to fill in additional details, such as the patient demographics, how the outcome was determined, whether the organism was resistant, and other details. And we have found that the quick submit case can be entered in just a moment or so, and a few minutes to enter the full case report form. But we have worked tirelessly to make sure that the case report form is easy for clinicians to use. It was developed by clinicians and public health specialists for clinicians. And so it follows the typical pattern that a clinician is used to for a case report form, and provides the information, captures it in a systematic fashion using controlled terminology so that it can be readily aggregated together, and presents the information publicly to all other users so that they can learn from those experiences. But again, with the information being completely de-identified to protect the patient's privacy. And a user has the option to anonymize a particular case submission or discussion post if they so choose. So that is an option as well. Here's an example of the COVID-19 case report I showed previously using tocilizumab, in which the patient deteriorated. So you can see this is the quick submit information with the summary level overview, that the patient was a PCR lab confirmed, as well as imaging confirmed case of COVID, and suffered from a stroke. Then you can see the information, so the patient characteristics, comorbidities and co-infections, how the diagnosis was made, details of the treatment, including the dose, duration, route, and route of administration, and how each drug was used in a new way, as well as its treatment setting, which would be a proxy for severity, and then the outcome, both including the method for outcome determination, as well as when the outcome was assessed and whether the patient relapsed. Additional users can then comment on a case report or a discussion post, and so can engage with the original author of the post to ask clarifying questions or seek additional information. The discussion post is the other way that a user can contribute information. This is a much more free text form. All you do is select a disease and then enter a free text title and body of a paragraph or question. And this allows users to then engage with healthcare providers all over the world. And this has been a very active part of the app. The newsfeed allows users to sort of stay up to date with the latest and greatest that's going on. So here we can see a comment that was posted by a physician about a case report, in fact, of ivermectin being tried for COVID-19, as well as a journal article on hydroxychloroquine that was shared. So how exactly does the platform work? Just to walk you through the steps. A healthcare provider submits a case report form via the app or the website using completely de-identified information and largely standardized terminology. Once that case is posted, it's rapidly reviewed, typically within 12 hours, by CureID moderators with the goal of ensuring quality and accuracy. The moderators may contact the user for additional details or clarification, and in the unlikely event that the case fails to meet the terms of service and the disclaimers that the user agreed to, it could be removed. The data from the case reports is then aggregated to show the total number of cases using each drug as either monotherapy or specific combination therapies, and then is further broken down by treatment outcome. And this allows users to see sort of the full breadth of information that's available in both the published literature as well as clinician submitted cases, and to see, how different drugs compare to each other or combinations compare to each other in terms of which might look the most promising. Now, again, this information is solely for the purpose of hypothesis generation. It's in no way confirmatory evidence, but it can potentially, with sufficient numbers of cases, so please submit your cases, it can potentially be a signal or hypothesis generator. And then users also have the option to download the entire de-identified data set to conduct their own research. So the information is all open source and readily available. The data curation is an important component. The data is contributed by a healthcare provider and submitted through the case report form, where it is then reviewed by a CureID curator. And if there are questions, they can ask the data contributor to confirm information, provide additional details, or clarify statements that were made. And then the curated information is visible on the website. So we are often asked who can participate. The app is open to licensed healthcare professionals around the world. It is a global platform, and the goal is for them to be able to report their clinical experiences. And healthcare professionals here we define to include physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, nurses, as well as pharmacists. So other key features of the platform: it is free, it is an open source and globally accessible platform, And I should note that it also includes offline capabilities for access in resource-limited settings. So for example, a user can download some of the information to their phone, and they can also save a case report and then upload it once they have internet access at a later point in time. As I said before, the information is all collected in a de-identified manner, is curated, and the author has the ability to anonymize individual submissions, with the hope in particular that this will encourage the submission of treatments that were unsuccessful as well as those that were successful, to try to help counterbalance the positive publication bias that often exists. With that, we have an emphasis on both successful and unsuccessful treatments, because what doesn't work is as important as what does. And we also emphasize inclusion of adverse events to try to understand the safety implications of these drugs when they are used in new ways and in new populations. And our goal is that this should be an opportunity to connect clinicians around the world and provide a sort of one-stop shop of information where they're able to access as much high-quality data as exists as possible in the absence of established safety and efficacy of products for these diseases. There are a variety of potential uses of the platform, which have frankly been recently demonstrated because of the COVID pandemic. So these include serving as a rapid communication platform for healthcare providers during an outbreak and providing for systematic case sharing discussions in the latest literature. Again, serving as this important step between the collection of unstructured anecdotal reports, as is currently published in the literature, and the robust randomized trials that would ultimately be required for drug approval. This could be an important bridge between those two. It also enables the exchange of opinions from global communities of experts and with those with very different treatment experiences. And of course, our hope is that it will help to identify potential new uses for existing drugs while limiting the unhelpful or harmful uses. A review of a few numbers. To date, we have 325 infectious diseases included, with nearly 1,600 case reports, more than 5,600 activated users, and nearly 19,000 clinical trials included. We've made some important updates to the CureID platform in support of the COVID response. This includes, these updates include facilitating clinician reporting of their real-world experiences treating COVID-19 patients whenever those patients are unable to be enrolled in a clinical trial. And this includes promotion as of last week by FDA, NIH, CDC, IDSA, and other partners, all coming out to suggest that clinicians report their experiences with COVID-19 patients to this platform. It also includes an updated case report form that has been tailored to COVID-19 with data fields that have been harmonized with other real-world data in clinical trial platforms to try to enable multiple sources of data to be aggregated together and used to inform ongoing trials. It enables the data to be entered with adverse events automatically shared with FDA's MedWatch adverse reporting system, so that a clinician doesn't have to submit 2 different case report forms to share a case where there was an adverse event that occurred. But it should be noted that voluntary submission of cases to CureID is not a substitute for filing information with regulatory and public health authorities where that may be required. We are now updating the clinical trials for COVID nearly daily, and it includes about 750 clinical trials of COVID-19 treatments, including vaccines, drugs, and biologics. We also update the app daily with COVID-19 journal articles, news articles, and events. And to date, we have almost 160 detailed case reports of COVID-19 treatments that have been either extracted from the published literature or entered by clinician users, with the data displayed both in detail as individual reports and in an aggregated format. Here are some of the numbers. So 158 case reports, 81 discussion quiz and nearly 750 clinical trials. And we've included 310 journal articles, 215 news articles, and 35 events. The information that we have on COVID-19 as of now is, of the 150 cases reported, more than 65 repurposed drugs have been identified, and 15 of these drugs have been used in 10 or more cases. So the current goals of the project are to get cases submitted to the CureID platform from as many healthcare providers as possible if they choose to use an approved product for an unapproved use. And this is where we really encourage all of you, as well as your colleagues and friends, to submit your cases. It's a very easy process. And if you have large numbers of cases, we would be happy to work with you directly to upload that information. This is a way for you to contribute to the global clinical community and help to identify potentially safe and effective treatments that could aid COVID patients. It provides a platform for discussion, which is really crucial during this pandemic, and particularly on a global level, to enable healthcare providers in different places and different specialties to engage with one another, and to responsibly share the limited data that is available, recognizing its limitations. So the goal is to use these anecdotal reports, but captured in a systematic manner and then aggregated, to inform randomized clinical trials as rapidly as possible. And we look forward to working with DNDi, WHO, and other partners to be able to make that a reality. As I said, we're now collaborating with a number of partners officially to promote the use of CureID as a tool to collect cases on treatment of COVID-19 patients in conjunction with ongoing clinical trial efforts. And these activities are also being coordinated through our existing partnership with WHO. And healthcare providers are encouraged to share their cases. And a reminder that when necessary, please submit your cases to the relevant public health authorities as well. So, do any of you have cases to share? While we of course recommend that and encourage patients to be enrolled in a clinical trial wherever that may be possible, we recognize that it isn't always available. And so in those cases where it's not feasible, if you've used an existing drug approved for another indication to treat a patient with SARS-CoV-2, if you've used a combination of approved products, or if you have safety concerns with the use of an approved product being used in a new way, please share your cases now on CureID. Our hope is that by utilizing the CureID platform now for COVID-19 case collection, in conjunction with data gathered from other registries, EHR systems, and clinical trials, that the data collected during an outbreak can be improved and coordinated, and that this may allow us to facilitate research to find possible treatments to help ease this pandemic, as well as prepare us better to fight the next one, because sadly, there will be a next one. Now, the question always remains, how do we translate the collection of anecdotal reports to inform clinical trials and then potentially even drug labeling? And it's been our belief for a number of years that it's important to establish a consortium of stakeholders who all have a piece of this pie in this complicated process of translation of scientific findings and anecdotal reports to sort of full drug development information. And so one of the goals is to establish this consortium and then have the partners really work to identify a clear pathway forward, both for generating adequate evidence from RCTs, as well as submitting that evidence to the FDA and others such as WHO for review. So with that, I'm very pleased to announce the launch of the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory. As was stated before by Mary Ann, this project was initiated in 2013 and has been a labor of love that has been going on for several years and has expanded. And we are very grateful to be able to be working with the Critical Path Institute, which has announced that it will convene a public-private partnership in collaboration with FDA and NIH, which, as I said, was called the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, or CDRC. This collaboratory will begin with a pilot focused on furthering drug development for COVID-19 through use of the CureID platform and translation into clinical trials, and ultimately, hopefully, drug approvals. And the goal will be that the collaboratory will demonstrate how data shared from clinicians in real time can be used to inform ongoing and future trials, and how those trials could then potentially inform drug labeling. I encourage all of you to also get involved with the CDRC in addition to sharing your cases through the CureID platform. There are opportunities to join as an institutional partner, serve on an advisory or coordinating committee, become a CureID curator, contribute your data set to the CureID database, or participate as a CureID clinical champion to help get the word out. And you can visit the consortium's website at cpath.org/programs/CDRC, or email the address here if you're interested in getting involved. So with that, I also encourage you to participate and get in touch more broadly. Please visit the website, and if you have comments or suggestions, you can email us at the Cure Support address. I'd like to thank our many partners and collaborators. This has been an effort that has required input from many, many people over the years, and we couldn't have done it without all of them. And a thank you to all of the members of the CureID team, as well as our volunteers, advisors, and funders. And here are some references if you so choose. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heather, and some very good news. We have Blessing Ziwa, who's on the chat function, already told us, first of all, this is a lovely presentation, and Blessing has already downloaded the app and says it is user-friendly.
Terrific.
So
wonderful to hear that.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Everybody else should join Blessing and do so as well.
Absolutely. We would definitely encourage everyone to explore the platform. I think what was really striking about your presentation was in terms of design, how very streamlined this app is, and given the huge amount of use this will have across very many diseases, but also across countries and lots of different users. This has been a very nice way to make it such a user-friendly interface, and I'm sure a lot of work went into that.
Thanks, Nathalie, for many suggestions over the years.
The expert eye, the eagle eye.
Yes.
Absolutely. And everyone, I hope, really heard your calls for partnerships, Heather, to not just engage with the app as a user and hopefully share it as well across your organizations and networks, but also to be really involved with some of the networks.
Look at that.
Nathalie is another user. Fantastic.
I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us to engage collaboratively, and excited to see partnerships arise from this webinar. So thank you.
Fantastic. And we did have just one very brief question for you, Heather, from Van Jerwin Mercado. Van's tuning in from the Philippines, along with a couple other of our attendees. So hello to everyone in the Philippines and worldwide tuning in. And Van was asking, does the CureID platform require reporting health professionals to secure informed consent from the patients? And if so, how is this guaranteed?
It does not. Because the data is collected in a completely de-identified fashion, it is not necessary to collect informed consent from the patients. It certainly can be. We always encourage that the patients are informed and understand when a drug is being used in a novel way, just as one would in a clinical trial. But for the purposes of the data collection itself, it's not required.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Great question.
Yep, thanks for that. Thanks, Heather, and thanks, Van. We do have many more questions, as you can imagine. Lots of people very interested from around the world to collaborate, participate, see how they can also support this initiative. But perhaps before we move on to that, we'll hand over to Tiziana. Tiziana, you've done quite a substantial landscape study of, we've heard about the app, we've seen how it works, and we've also heard from Nathalie what the gaps that it's trying to fill and tackle. And now we'll hear from you about the results practical results of the use of the app.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting us here. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tiziana Masini, and I'll present the results of a landscape analysis that we have been conducting in the past few months with WHO and the FDA to assess the utility and the feasibility and the added value of the Curation app platform for a variety of infectious diseases, including the NTDs. So I'll go very quickly on the first few slides because Nathalie and Heather already touched on all these points, and I want to leave enough room for the discussions. I just want to underline that WHO recognizes that a significant proportion of currently used medicines of several NTDs, tuberculosis, and other IDs are repurposed. Here in the box, you just see a few examples, but for example, just to make a very extreme case, in tuberculosis, almost all the drugs that are being used are basically repurposed, even though they've been used by clinicians for so long that they basically became the standard of care, the normal practice for clinicians. As Nathalie already pointed out, in the absence of new compounds, repurposing has several advantages, and we all know that drug discovery and development it can take a long time, and that there is a high failure rate as long as the drugs move on into the pipeline. So this is why it's very important, while looking for new compounds, for example, new chemical entities or new drugs with new mechanism of actions, which may help, for example, against drug resistant strains. It's important to focus in parallel on drug repurposing too, because this can help deliver better and safer and also more affordable treatment options for patients for all the reasons that Nathalie already explained. I will just comment briefly on these slides because you see that I added a question mark here, trial versus other patient data sources. Well, is it really trials against or versus other patient data sources? I don't think it is. Of course, carrying out clinical trials is extremely important, but it's not always being done, or it's not always feasible, specifically for very group of patients, very often pregnant women, children, and so on. So is this really one thing against the other? Well, it's not. I mean, the two approaches should be carried out in parallel, and they should not be seen as one as an alternative to the other, but rather as complementary approaches. In tuberculosis, for example, where the R&D pipeline has been delivering only very recently the first two drugs approved for MDR-TB in the past 40 years, relying on pooled data sets from observational studies or meta-analysis from individual patient data has been informing basically the WHO guideline development in the past few years, and this article from the Lancet is just one example. So for all these reasons, the WHO and the US FDA decided to establish a collaboration, because we believe that the systematic collection of real world experience through online databases like Curation can be really informative and support potential regulatory approval, but also WHO guideline development and national policies development. This is the reason why we established this collaboration, which is focused around on the WHO perspective, trying to understand how this approach, and specifically the Curation platform, can be optimally used by practitioners facing challenging clinical situations. So as I will explain in a minute, this means to understand which disease areas this approach is most needed in terms of course, first of all, the public health needs, but also where it can be more feasible to collect a relevant number of case reports that can be as informative as possible, but also in parallel trying to map out what's already being done out there in specific disease areas. So for example, technologies that clinicians may already be using. So this slide summarizes the methodology that we use for the landscape analysis. On your left-hand side, you can see number of disease areas that we started from. We started investigating. This doesn't mean that all the other disease areas are not relevant, but we just needed to start somewhere because both the desk review and the key informant interviews took quite a lot of time. So this is just an initial set of diseases that we considered. And as you see, a few NTDs were also included in the initial list, which are the ones highlighted in bold. So after selecting this preliminary list, we carried out a desk review, and we also had interviews with many national and international experts in each of the relevant disease areas. Unfortunately, due to the COVID outbreak, we couldn't finalize the analysis, but we hope to be able to finalize it in the coming few weeks. Some of the criteria we use to prioritize the disease areas where to focus the dissemination of Curation are listed here, even though they are not all of them. But of course, there's the need to look for suitable treatment options which are safe and effective, and for diseases for which these treatment options are currently not available, or maybe they're not suitable. But also we try to collect as much information as possible about initiatives that are already ongoing that could be complementary to Curation, as we have no intention to reinvent the wheel. It's also important to understand whether there are enough opportunities to disseminate the application and make sure that as many clinicians as possible use the app, so that we collect a relevant number of case reports. So the presence of an engaged disease-specific community with working groups, workshops, conferences, which are happening quite frequently, is particularly important. Of course, something that I didn't list here because I think it's quite obvious, but I wanted to mention it very briefly, is it's something which is very important, is that if we prioritize a certain disease area, it's very important that clinicians in their daily practice do try medicines that do not have approved indications for that specific disease. For example, they could be medicines approved for other diseases, or medicines which are still in development, for example. And there are other criteria, for example, the fact that whether, let's say, some specific diseases are treated by specialists or not, or for example by specialized centers. So this is very important again for the dissemination part of the app, which is essential to collect a relevant number of case report. Now, today I will focus the remaining part of my presentation on NTDs, but should you have any question on the additional disease areas that are listed here, please do not hesitate to reach out. So I will start from mycetoma, and in particular from eumycetoma. Why it's important to collect case reports through Curation for this disease area? Well, first of all, it's very relevant from a public health perspective because of the lack of safe and effective treatment options for eumycetoma. Indeed, the cure rates are very low at the moment. They often involve treatment with antifungals and surgery, and the treatment is usually quite long, with an average duration of 12 months. And as you probably know, DNDi, and as Nathalie, I think she mentioned it earlier, DNDi is conducting a trial in collaboration with the Mycetoma Research Center in Sudan, and the results of the trial will be available in 2 years. Another positive aspect of prioritizing mycetoma for this dissemination of the app is the fact that the causative agents are endemic in selected countries, and that the Mycetoma Research Center in Khartoum, in Sudan, is a worldwide recognized institution working on mycetoma. Very often clinicians call or send emails to this research center to ask questions. So the fact that there is a sort of centralization of the requests could really help to collect a relevant number of case reports. We still have some not really concerns, I think I used the wrong term here, but pending questions, which we would still like to investigate more closely. First of all, we are aware that not too much repurposing is going on in Sudan, where most patients failing itraconazole undergo surgery while continuing treatment. So we are currently seeking additional information on whether this is the practice also in other endemic countries. As I mentioned earlier, the treatment is very long and it has less definite treatment outcomes and also a high rate of loss to follow-up. And while the fact that CureID is a rather simplified case report form should and will encourage clinicians hopefully to input case reports because they don't need too much time for it, it may also mean that the case report form would need to be adapted to adequately capture the information on mycetoma patients in an informative way. As I mentioned, probably I didn't mention it before, but one of the aspects that we are also looking at is whether there is reliable diagnostics in place for each of the disease areas, because CureID associates the treatment with the treatment outcome. So it's very important that there is this connection. While for mycetoma, the diagnosis is quite complex and very often it's based on clinical examination. So what are we going to do next? While mycetoma seems to be an ideal candidate for the dissemination of CureID, we are still planning to collect additional information on the drug repurposing practices in other endemic countries, and we also plan additional discussions on the potential use of CureID to help address the gap between preclinical and clinical stages. As we know, very often drugs which are investigated in the preclinical stages are not translated into clinical studies. So we are planning to have discussions with relevant stakeholders to on shortlisting promising candidates in preclinical stages and potentially test them in small and focused pilot studies with the information and the outcomes potentially being stored in case reports in CureID. And these pilot or studies or more focused studies could of course be informative for bigger and broader clinical trials. I just want to also take the opportunity to inform all of you that WHO, together with the US FDA, with Heather and others, we will organize a virtual workshop specifically on mycetoma to discuss all the points that I touched upon today. This will be held on the 10th of July. It's a Friday from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. CET. So if you're interested to participate in the discussion, please get in touch with us for more details, and we'll be happy to give you any information. So on top of mycetoma, we also started to look at other fungal infections, in particular at chromoblastomycosis and other deep mycosis. Now, for chromoblastomycosis, the analysis is still ongoing. As I mentioned before, COVID unfortunately didn't help with this, but it seems to be the case that we will have similar issues to what we have been discussing with mycetoma. Someone we talked to also encouraged us to look for partners who are more experts in the dermatology space to help again with the dissemination of the app. I also want to take the opportunity to mention that, as mentioned before, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we started to get in touch with initiatives that are already ongoing, in particular in this specific disease area, Fungiscope, which probably most of you are very familiar with, and they were very interested to link with us and to make sure that the two initiatives are complementary and well connected. The idea behind Fungiscope is very similar. It's very similar to CureID, but for example, their case reports form is much more detailed. They focus on a specific subgroup of fungal infections. So there is room for collaboration. Again, there doesn't have to be competition, but rather collaboration, and this is something we are working on. For leishmaniasis, We had initially preliminarily shortlisted, especially visceral leishmaniasis, considering also the potential complementarity between CureID and the work that is currently done by the IDDO on VL, collecting and analyzing clinical trial data worldwide. However, from the few interviews that we held with the VL experts, it became apparent that the treatment for VL is rather standardized. Clinicians have basically a specific, not specific, but a rather, like a box of drugs to use and specific protocols they can look at. And the experts that we talked to, who know also a lot about what clinicians do in the field, believe that even when clinicians experience patients with treatment failures, they basically know already what to do because the protocols are rather standardized. Also, we heard that even though there seems to be quite a lot of literature about people who have tried other medications for VL, it doesn't seem to look too promising, and so far it hasn't really delivered anything useful. It's also true that there is a lot of R&D effort going on VL, especially in the late stage of the pipeline at the moment. So, considering all these factors, we decided not to prioritize VL at this stage of the project, but we were also encouraged to look at cutaneous leishmaniasis, which is an area where clinicians may be trying repurposed drugs for complicated cases. So this is something that we plan to do in the near future. So in the last part of my presentation, I will briefly talk about dengue and chikungunya. Zika is mentioned here, even though it's not an NTD, but the experts basically in dengue and chikungunya are often also the clinicians who are experts in Zika or who handle Zika cases. So that's why I decided to mention it here. From a public health perspective, well, there's no specific treatment options for these diseases, no WHO guidelines available, and most guidelines out there focus on pain relief strategies, recommending paracetamol or other painkillers to control the symptoms. From the interviews we had, it emerged that especially clinicians treating dengue are actually trying medicines approved for other indications, but that the information is not collected systematically, which seems to be the ideal scenario for the dissemination of CureID. From the point of view of the dissemination, we also learned that the community of clinicians treating dengue is pretty large and active, and that we could also have the possibility to disseminate the use of the app through some courses and events that WHO holds a few times per year in several countries. Regarding some of the pending questions that we have, so we would ideally like to collect additional evidence that clinicians, especially those seeing patients for dengue, do try to use repurposed medicines, so that the repurposed practice is quite widespread, and that the focus isn't only on the clinical management / supportive care for these infections, which, for example, seems to be the case for chikungunya. So for the way forward in general, considering that dengue is becoming an emerging threat with more outbreaks happened in 2019, dengue seems to be a good candidate at the moment to prioritize the dissemination of CureID. One area which is completely neglected, it's in terms of drugs which are available or treatment options and clinical attention in general, is dengue in pregnant women. So we are thinking to focus our attention particularly on that. And in the future, we could also consider adapting CureID to collect information about patient management and supportive care. This would need some adaptation of the case reports in CureID, but as it seems to be extremely relevant for these disease areas, this is something that we would be happy to consider. And as I mentioned earlier, given that the community around these three disease areas is pretty much the same, we could also think about expanding the dissemination efforts to Zika and chikungunya. So last but not least, as the analysis is still ongoing, we would be very happy to hear from you whether you have ideas on additional disease areas in the NTD space, but also beyond that, that we should consider, considering all the criteria and all the challenges and added values that I just described. If you have any idea in mind or any relevant disease areas where you think that collecting case reports could be very relevant and informative, please get in touch with us, and we can have a call or organize Zoom teleconference or and so on. And also we welcome any feedback you may have on dissemination strategies. So, for example, events, webinars, workshops, or people that you think we could get in touch with to help spread the voice about CureID and this project in general. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tiziana. Thank you for that. And I believe that that message went out very loud and clear. So number one, please get in touch with your ideas of which diseases should be prioritized or included within the drug repurposing search and effort, and also any networks and events and any opportunities at all to disseminate the information and the awareness about this app. So please definitely get in touch. I am aware that we've reached more or less 3:30 UK time. We'd said about 90 minutes for this webinar. However, there are a lot of conversations going on the chat and a lot of questions. So I just wanted to ask the speakers if that's okay with you, if we could carry on for a few more minutes, unless you must run. That's completely understandable as well. It's entirely up to you. Would it be okay?
I can stay for a few minutes, yeah. But Nathalie, if you need to run, it's okay.
All right, thank you. So something interesting, actually, you were mentioning what could be included, focusing on diseases or any aspects. And I noticed this is something that's been brought up twice on the chat by our attendees, but also interestingly was one of the questions yesterday on the WHO NTD webinar. And it seems to me there's a real interest about exploring and looking at sort of local and herbal traditional medicines. Oh, sorry, I misunderstood that completely. Nathalie had to leave. I thought she was saying, yes, I'm going to stay. Okay, well, Nathalie's gone. So for the recorded version of this, thank you, Nathalie, so much. And we'll keep in touch by other means. So Heather, Tiziana, what do you think? What are your thoughts about perhaps exploring in a different way some of the more traditional remedies or herbal remedies that tend to be very prevalent in areas? And I think that's something that's been mentioned a couple times by some of our colleagues here.
Sure, I can jump in with a response to that. So, I mean, I do think that there is significant opportunity in terms of the potential activity of traditional and herbal medicines. Certainly, we have seen historically that things like tree bark, like many herbs, that a lot of the drugs that we have originated in some form or another from herbal or traditional medicine. So it's not a problematic concept in that sense. I think the challenge is there are several major challenges. So one is that historically, there have not been randomized trials or sort of stringent methodologies applied to studying those products in the same way that there have been with more traditional Western medicines. And these are broad brushstrokes, so it's not true for everything, but that's one issue. The second is that there may be issues with manufacturing and quality control and that kind of thing. And the third is that from a repurposing perspective per se, and from a regulatory perspective, it lacks some of the advantages that using an already approved drug has. So particularly what Nathalie was focusing on in terms of the time and cost reduction that can be achieved by using an already approved drug, because most of these products are not already approved, at least in the US. That's not necessarily true in other countries, but from the US regulatory perspective, they would have to go through the full course of drug development, including all of the preclinical toxicology, phase 1 studies, et cetera, et cetera. And so you'd be looking at your traditional, 10 to 12 to 15 year development period, as well as the full cost of that development, which, as you saw from Nathalie's slides with fexinidazole, for example, was 55 million euros, as opposed to 5 million euros. So I think it is something that is being pursued. Many drug screens that are done to look at sort of preclinical repurposing opportunities and whether drugs are active against certain targets do include natural products, and many antibiotics do have an initial start in sort of the natural product space. But it, like I said, I think it lacks some of the advantages of repurposing of an already approved product.
Brilliant, thank you. I just wanted to take this opportunity to read a really nice comment by Teysa Villa, who said, "Great panel. Loved every minute and would like to highlight it is the first time I sit on a panel composed 100% by females." So I also felt very proud of that when the panel kind of, came together. We did have one on hand washing. Obviously, hand washing was the big issue of the moment. And our hand washing panel, I'm also very proud to say, was entirely a female panel. So, that's lovely. Back to kind of looking at partnerships and interesting ways to share, to wider audiences, the app, and then more fundamentally, the effort at repurposing drugs. We had just a quick question here from Emmanuel Agunoye, who's working in diagnostics. I'm a diagnostics medical laboratory worker. And are we relevant on this software, i.e. In what ways could we support it? And likewise, we also had here a comment by Aftab Uddin. Aftab is currently involved in a project supported by WHO TDR in capacity building, in a capacity building initiative that's looking at implementation research. And Aftab was saying brilliant and very pertinent presentations. For me, a very new way of looking into NTDs. And Aftab was also wondering how could I link it and fit it with my current project in capacity building. So 2 individuals not directly in the field of drug discovery, drug repurposing, but so for anyone else who kind of is very interested in this initiative, how could they go about to support it?
I think that's a great question. So the app itself is geared towards healthcare professionals specifically, and it was very strategically designed that way. And it's always a balance, right? There are certainly many benefits that could be gained to having a broader audience be able to participate, but there are also significant drawbacks. And one of the things that we heard from many of the clinicians that we spoke to in the years that we spent developing the app was that for them to feel comfortable sharing their experiences and particularly sharing their treatment failures, they really wanted it to be sort of a closed and safe clinical community. And the quality was also a major concern. And so if you look at other platforms, for example, they're often limited specifically to infectious disease specialists or at least to physicians. And we try to go broader than that with all healthcare providers. Some of them require, a medical license number and various, IDs to certify that they're licensed healthcare professionals. And we just have people state that they are. So it's a balance. I think in terms of implementation research, that's a more obvious extension where this is very much sort of part of implementation of the drug development spectrum in the post-marketing space. And with both the laboratory and the implementation, I think, even if there is not a role for that individual directly in terms of their participation in the app, they can certainly help to promote the idea behind the platform and to encourage their friends or colleagues who are clinical care providers to contribute. So we would encourage them, or their institutions to be involved. So we would encourage that sort of collaboration. Tiziana, I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add to that.
No, I think you covered it really well. I was curious to know if someone has any suggestion on other disease areas that we could. I tried to look at the chat, but well, I was presenting, and then I don't know. Maybe Marianne had a closer look.
I see somebody suggested elephantiasis, which is a great suggestion, and actually was one of our original 8 neglected tropical diseases that we started out with at the very beginning. So lymphatic filariasis does have some repurposing. Actually, there are several approved products. No, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. I think the issue that we ran into, it's been a few years since we looked at it. I think the issue that we ran into was that while the products were not approved in the US at least, there were sort of 1 or 2 drugs that were used virtually all of the time. And so and there had been several clinical trials, I think. And so it didn't seem to make sense to necessarily emphasize that as an initial starting point for the app. It is in the app, and you could certainly add cases if you have unique treatment experiences, but that's why it wasn't one of the initial areas of focus any longer.
Yes, and very interestingly, perhaps our audience is kind of asking you, saying, would it be possible to include NOMA, and what about diabetes and so forth? So we'll definitely send over the chat text over to you. There have been a lot of contributions. It's not going to be possible to get around to all the questions, I'm afraid, as well as all the comments. But once again, we certainly had a really varied and international audience, and just saying hello to a few, but we had Emmanuel Ochola from Le Corps Hospital in Uganda, Andrea Ramos Fernandez da Silva, greetings from Brazil. We had Bumkuth Match tuning in from South Sudan, and Arlene Batuzo and Van from the Philippines, and Tessa Villa from Baltimore, USA. So very international, everyone. Really thanking you for all these fantastic presentations, and some people actually coming in a way for the first time to the concept of drug repurposing and really wondering, how can I integrate this into my normal thinking, and how. So thank you very much for bringing this to the forefront of our minds.
Thank you so much, Marianne.
So by all means, the conversations are not over. I think Heather and Tiziana have made it really absolutely clear that they're very much open to suggestions, open to collaborations. I know a lot of our attendees have certainly put their email addresses and so forth. So hopefully to be continued.
Please do reach out.
And I mean, if you would like to perhaps give us the last few words, food for thought, on what you would really like to see happening next, or how can our attendees and our network really support you? I know you've given us lots of ideas in your presentation, but really if there was one thing right now that we could all go and do for you, what would that be?
Well, I think the first thing is download the app and register if you're a healthcare provider, or alert your friends and your networks to this resource and encourage them to share their cases. The second would be to consider institutionally partnering or joining our public-private partnership as a contributor or curator or advisory committee member. And the third is help us to try to realize this idea of capturing these anecdotal cases in a systematic way, translating them into a clinical trial, and then ultimately to drug approvals.
Fantastic. And yourself, Tiziana?
Heather always anticipates me on everything. She covered everything. But well, do reach out should you have any question or idea or even criticism, because we are very happy to that as well. As I mentioned during my presentation, the analysis is still ongoing, so we still have a lot of pending questions, and we are going to investigate some of the disease areas more specifically with a smaller group of experts. So if you are interested in that, please follow ID here on Twitter. We'll post updates and everything on there. And from the WHO perspective, again, if you have additional ideas on areas where this approach could be helpful in NTDs or beyond, do drop me a message, and I'll respond surely very soon. Thank you.
Absolutely, and we have no doubt of that. WHO, particularly the Neglected Tropical Diseases Department, has been really very inclusive, and you always consult a lot with these very international networks, whether it be for the roadmap, whether it be for refining CureID. So we know you're very open, so thank you for that. And Heather, same with you. Lots of attendees joining me to say thank you. Fasia Tairu, interesting webinar. Many thanks to the speakers, Yalda, Ravan, Shant as well. Thanks a lot. Majid Fasihi Harandi, who himself gave a talk a few days ago. Thank you all. Informative, nice meeting. And a final huge thank you to both our speakers today. Thanks for your time. We wish you very well, and no doubt we will be in touch very soon.
Thank you so much, Marian. Thank you, Tiziana, and thanks to Nathalie.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks to our attendees.
Bye.
See you next
Bye.
week. And keep safe, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.